I was in the kitchen, minding my own business, when I heard that laughter. It was coming from the house next door. Jack, my neighbor, had this loud, boisterous laugh that always seemed to carry through the walls. But what caught me off guard was that I recognized another laugh, Karen's. My wife's laughter, mixed with his, felt like a punch to the gut. Karen had told me she was just dropping off some homemade cookies, something she did for the neighbors now and then. But they'd been laughing together for a while now. And it didn't sit right with me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. But as I stood there, the sound of their voices lingered, scratching at the back of my mind. When Karen came home later, she was in high spirits. She hugged me like everything was normal, but there was something off in her eyes. She avoided my gaze, and when I asked how her day was, she was vague, dismissing it as just another afternoon. The seeds of doubt were planted, but I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe work stress was getting to me. Yet, the image of them laughing together kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Karen found more reasons to visit Jack. First, it was because his computer wasn't working properly, and she was good with tech. Then it was his garden. He apparently needed help with some new plants. Every time she went over, she had a different excuse, and every time I tried to push down my suspicions. But the more I watched her, the more things didn't add up. She would leave with a smile, but when she came back, she was always quiet, her mood oddly subdued. And Jack? He started acting strangely too, going out of his way to avoid me whenever I was outside. It was as if they both knew something they didn't want me to find out. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I followed her. I watched as she knocked on Jack's door, and he opened it with that same wide grin. He welcomed her in, and they stood there for a moment, their bodies too close for comfort, their hands brushing against each other. My heart was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. I stayed hidden, waiting, hoping that what I suspected wasn't true. But when I saw them hug, the way she held onto him just a second too long, something inside me snapped. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I waited for her to come home. I listened to her fabricated stories about helping Jack, all the while knowing that she was lying straight to my face. The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage was crumbling, and all I could think about was finding out the truth. The next day, when Karen mentioned that Jack was having internet problems, I decided to test her. I casually said I'd overheard Jack complaining about it and suggested she go over to help. Her face lit up, almost too eagerly, and that was all the confirmation I needed. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, plotting. I knew I had to be careful and patient. I wouldn't confront them until I had all the proof I needed. And when the time was right, they'd both realize just how big of a mistake they'd made. The next morning, I woke up with a singular focus: I needed proof. It wasn't enough to suspect or even to have seen them together, I needed undeniable evidence. My mind was racing with thoughts of how to collect it without tipping them off. At work, I couldn't concentrate. I spent most of the day researching ways to catch them in the act. By the time I left the office, I had a plan. I needed to bring someone else into this, someone I could trust. Tom, one of our neighbors, was a private investigator. We'd had a few beers together over the years, and I knew he was discreet. That evening, I knocked on his door and explained my situation, leaving out as much emotion as possible. He listened without interrupting, his face a mask of professional detachment. When I finished, he nodded. "I'll help you," he said simply. Over the next few days, Tom installed hidden cameras and recording devices in Jack's house. He was careful, making sure not to leave any trace. We agreed that I would collect the evidence on my own terms. As Tom worked, I kept up appearances at home. I continued my routine, making sure Karen didn't suspect anything. I even encouraged her to spend time with Jack, feigning indifference whenever she mentioned him. Inside, I was seething, but I couldn't let it show. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and Tom kept me updated on what the cameras were capturing. Every time I received a text from him, my heart would pound in my chest, dreading what I might see. But I knew I had to face it. This was the only way I could move forward. Finally, the day came when Tom handed me a small USB drive. "It's all here," he said, his voice heavy with sympathy. I took it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Now, I had what I needed to confront them, but I wasn't ready to do it just yet. I wanted to be sure that when I did, it would have the maximum impact. I spent the next few nights watching the footage alone, in the dark. It was worse than I had imagined. Seeing Karen with Jack, the way she looked at him, the way they touched, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. But with each painful moment, my resolve grew stronger. I was going to make them pay for what they had done. I chose my moment carefully. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I knew Karen was at Jack's house again. I didn't wait for them to be alone, I wanted witnesses. I wanted them to feel the shame and embarrassment of being caught red-handed. I walked over, my heart pounding in my ears. As I approached the door, I could hear their voices inside, laughing again, just like that first day. I didn't knock, I simply opened the door and walked in. The look on their faces was priceless. Karen's eyes went wide with shock, her hand flying to her mouth. Jack looked like a deer caught in the headlights, frozen in place. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence was suffocating. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice cold and steady. I pulled out my phone and played one of the recordings. Their faces drained of color as the audio filled the room, proof of their betrayal, undeniable and inescapable. Karen started to stammer, trying to explain, to lie her way out of it. But I wasn't interested in her excuses. "Save it," I cut her off. "I've seen and heard everything." I turned to Jack, who was still speechless, his face a mix of guilt and fear. "You thought you could do this behind my back, and I'd never find out?" I shook my head. "You're both going to regret this." I left them there, stunned and scrambling for words. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The first part of my plan was complete. Now, it was time to hit them where it really hurt. Back at home, I began packing my things. I wasn't going to wait for Karen to come crawling back with apologies and excuses. I left a note on the kitchen counter, along with copies of the evidence, and drove off, not looking back. The divorce papers would come soon enough. And she would find out that I had already secured everything, our house, our savings, well out of her reach. But that was just the beginning. By the time I was done, their lives would be as shattered as the trust they had destroyed. The following days were a whirlwind of cold calculations and relentless focus. I moved out of our house before Karen even had the chance to realize what was happening. I knew she would try to contact me, but I was determined to keep my distance. I blocked her number, disconnected from our mutual friends, and made sure she couldn't reach me. My lawyer, one of the best in town, was already drafting the divorce papers. I wanted everything handled swiftly and efficiently, with as little interaction as possible. I had anticipated Karen's next move. She would try to claim half of everything we owned. What she didn't know was that I had already taken steps to protect myself. Months ago, when my suspicions first began to fester, I had transferred all our major assets into a trust under my sole control. The house, the car, the savings accounts, everything was now out of her reach. As I packed up my belongings, I left behind only what was legally required and nothing more. I knew that once she found out, she'd be devastated, not just because of the betrayal being exposed, but because she would realize just how thoroughly I had outmaneuvered her. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her actions, the crushing reality of what she had lost. Meanwhile, Jack wasn't faring much better. The neighborhood was already buzzing with gossip. It didn't take long for word to spread about what had happened. I had been careful to leak just enough information to ensure that their affair would become public knowledge. I wanted everyone to see them for who they truly were. It wasn't long before the first signs of the fallout began to show. Jack's wife, who had been oblivious to his affair, received an anonymous package containing all the evidence I had gathered. I could only imagine her reaction when she opened it and saw the truth laid bare. Jack's life was about to come crashing down, just like mine had. But unlike him, I was ready for it. He wasn't. The neighborhood wasn't kind to them after that. Jack and Karen became the talk of every conversation, the scandal that everyone whispered about but no one addressed directly. It was exactly what I had intended. Every time they walked down the street, I wanted them to feel the stares, the judgment, the whispers behind their backs. Karen, once so confident and full of life, began to unravel. She tried reaching out to me through email, leaving desperate messages in my inbox. At first, they were full of apologies, pleas for forgiveness, promises that it was a mistake, that she still loved me. But when she realized I wasn't going to respond, her messages became more frantic, angry even. She accused me of overreacting, of being cruel. But I wasn't interested in her narrative. I had my own story to tell. As for Jack, his life was quickly falling apart. His wife left him, taking their kids and half of their possessions with her. She wasn't going to stay with a man who had so blatantly betrayed her. The divorce was swift and brutal, leaving Jack with little more than his damaged pride and a lonely house. The social gatherings that Jack once thrived in, the barbecues, the weekend drinks, those were gone. People began to distance themselves from him, from both of them. No one wanted to be associated with a couple that had caused such a scandal. They were outcasts now, living in the shadows of their former lives. I made sure to keep my distance, letting them stew in the mess they had created. I wasn't done with them yet, but for now, I was content to watch their world crumble. They had thought they could betray me and walk away unscathed. They were wrong. The isolation, the social rejection, it was all part of the plan, all part of the price they had to pay. And as I watched from afar, I felt a sense of satisfaction, a cold comfort in knowing that they were getting exactly what they deserved. The first steps of my revenge had been set into motion, but the game was far from over. With the social backlash in full swing, it was time to escalate my plan. Karen had yet to realize the full extent of the consequences she was about to face. She was still living in our house, perhaps clinging to the hope that things could return to some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy was long gone, and I intended to make that crystal clear. The divorce papers were served to her the following week. I made sure they were delivered by a process server in front of Jack's house, adding another layer of humiliation to the already smoldering scandal. The papers were ironclad, meticulously crafted by my lawyer to ensure that Karen would walk away with almost nothing. As expected, she was furious. She didn't understand how everything had turned so quickly, how the life she had known had slipped through her fingers. She called, she emailed, and she even tried showing up at my office, but I had no intention of giving her any satisfaction. The trust I had once had in her was shattered, and so was any sense of compassion. Karen had no choice but to hire her own lawyer, but by then, it was too late. The financial restructuring I had done months earlier was bulletproof. She had no legal claim to the assets I'd protected. In the end, she was left with little more than her personal belongings and a small settlement that wouldn't cover much more than her immediate expenses. Jack was in no better shape. His wife had taken him to the cleaners in their divorce. And the scandal had impacted his job as well. He was forced to sell his house to cover the legal fees and alimony, leaving him in a far worse financial position than he had ever imagined. He and Karen had become collateral damage in each other's lives, and it was a fitting punishment for their betrayal. I watched from a distance as Karen struggled to adjust to her new reality. She moved into a small apartment, far removed from the comfortable life she once had. Jack, on the other hand, disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. No one seemed to know where he had gone, and no one particularly cared. They had both become ghosts, reminders of the consequences of their actions. Chapter 8: Final Steps. With their financial and social lives in tatters, I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. I wanted them to understand that their betrayal had repercussions beyond just the material and social aspects of their lives. It was time to strike at the core of their identities. Karen had always been proud of her reputation at work. She was well liked and respected in her office, often praised for her dedication and professionalism. But I knew that her affair with Jack would be seen differently in the eyes of her colleagues. It was time for them to see the real Karen. I gathered all the evidence I had, photos, videos, emails, and sent it anonymously to her employer. I framed it as a concerned party who believed that the company should know about the character of the person they were employing. I knew it would only be a matter of time before the whispers started, before her reputation began to unravel. It wasn't long before the fallout reached her. The office was abuzz with rumors, and Karen found herself on the receiving end of suspicious glances and hushed conversations. She tried to maintain her composure, but the damage was done. Her boss called her in for a meeting, and while they couldn't fire her outright for personal indiscretions, they made it clear that her standing in the company had been severely compromised. The stress of it all began to take its toll on her. She was no longer the confident, self-assured woman she had once been. The walls were closing in on her, and there was no escape. I had taken everything from her: her marriage, her home, her finances, her social circle, and now, her professional life. All she had left was the hollow shell of the life she had ruined. As for Jack, I didn't need to do anything more. His life was already in shambles. The last I heard, he had moved to a different state, trying to start over, but the stain of what he had done would follow him wherever he went. He had lost everything: his family, his home, his job, and there was no coming back from that. I knew it was time to move on. I had exacted my revenge, and there was nothing left for me to gain from staying in the past. I packed up the last of my things and moved to a new city, ready to start fresh. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never let myself be betrayed again. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I felt a strange sense of peace. Justice had been served. I had thought that closing the door on my old life would bring me peace, but the past has a way of lingering. It wasn't long after my move to the new city that I started receiving anonymous messages. At first, they were just vague threats, but they quickly became more specific and more personal. Someone knew too much about what I had done, and they were making it clear that they weren't going to let it go. The first time I saw one of the messages, it was scrawled across the windshield of my car in red paint: "You'll pay for what you've done." I stared at it, my heart racing, realizing that someone had tracked me down and that my carefully orchestrated plan of revenge had not gone unnoticed. I tried to brush it off as a prank, maybe some random vandalism, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Whoever was behind this knew about Karen, about Jack, and about everything that had happened. The messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. They weren't just threats, they were promises of retribution. I began to suspect that it was Jack. He had the most to lose and the most reason to retaliate. But after some investigation, I learned that he was still out of state, trying to rebuild his life. It seemed unlikely that he would have the resources or the willpower to follow through on these threats. Then I considered Karen. Maybe she had finally snapped, unable to handle the weight of her ruined life. But when I dug deeper, I found out she was still stuck in her small apartment, barely holding onto her job. She was broken, but not vengeful. At least, not in the way these messages suggested. The mystery deepened, and the more I tried to uncover who was behind it, the more elusive they became. It was as if they were always one step ahead, always knowing exactly where to hit me next. I found myself looking over my shoulder, constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack. One night, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My blood ran cold as I slowly pushed it open, every muscle in my body tense. Inside, everything was in disarray: furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor. But nothing was missing. Whoever had done this hadn't been there to steal. They had been there to send a message. On the wall, written in the same red paint as before, were the words, "This isn't over." I knew then that I was dealing with someone who wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But what did they want? Revenge? Money? Or was it something else entirely? I couldn't let them control me with fear. I had to figure out who was behind this and put an end to it before they could do any real damage. But the more I tried to think logically, the more the paranoia set in. I started questioning everyone around me, coworkers, neighbors, even old friends. Could one of them be the mastermind? Or was it someone I hadn't even considered? The fear and uncertainty were consuming me. I had thought I was the one in control, the one pulling the strings, but now I was the one being manipulated. And I didn't know how to make it stop. Feeling cornered and vulnerable, I decided to take a drastic step. I reached out to the one person I had never expected to contact again, Tom, the private investigator who had helped me gather evidence against Karen and Jack. If anyone could help me unravel this mystery, it was him. Tom agreed to meet me in a discreet cafe downtown. As we sat across from each other, I could see the curiosity in his eyes. He had known me as a calculated, methodical man. And now here I was, clearly shaken and asking for help. "Someone's after me, Tom," I admitted, laying out the details of the messages, the break-in, and my suspicions. I could see him processing the information, his mind working through the possibilities. "Have you made any enemies besides Karen and Jack?" he asked, his tone professional but tinged with concern. "None that I know of," I replied, though even as I said it, I knew it sounded hollow. What had started as a personal vendetta had spiraled into something darker. And I couldn't be sure where the ripples of my actions had spread. Tom agreed to take on the case, but he warned me that this might be more complex than I was prepared for. He started by digging into Karen and Jack's backgrounds again, trying to see if there were any connections we had missed, anyone who might have a motive to come after me. As Tom worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The messages kept coming, more frequent and more unsettling. Whoever it was seemed to know every move I made. Every place I went. I started seeing shadows where there were none and hearing footsteps in empty hallways. The paranoia was eating away at me, and I knew that if this didn't stop soon, I would lose my mind. Then, one day, Tom called me with news that shattered everything I thought I knew. He had discovered a connection, a link between Jack and a figure from my past, someone I had crossed years ago in a business deal that had gone sour. It seemed that Jack had reached out to this person, perhaps out of desperation, and now they were using my own tactics against me. The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. I had underestimated the lengths to which people would go for revenge. This wasn't just about Karen and Jack anymore. This was about settling an old score, and I had walked right into their trap. I realized then that I couldn't fight this alone. I needed to form an alliance, no matter how distasteful it might be. I had to reach out to Karen and Jack, the very people I had destroyed, and convince them to help me take down this new enemy. It was the only way we would survive what was coming. With a sense of dread, I dialed Karen's number. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before she picked up. Her voice was wary, uncertain. "We need to talk," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "There's something you need to know." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had brought us all to this point with my thirst for revenge, and now I needed the help of the very people I had crushed. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that I had no choice but to take. As I hung up the phone, I knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. Meeting with Karen and Jack was the last thing I ever wanted to do. But I had no choice. The situation had spiraled out of control, and we were all in danger. I arranged for us to meet in a neutral location, a small, quiet park on the outskirts of town. It was isolated enough that we wouldn't be disturbed, but public enough that we wouldn't feel threatened. Karen arrived first, looking more worn and frail than I remembered. The confident woman I had known was gone, replaced by someone who had been through hell. Jack arrived a few minutes later, his eyes filled with suspicion and resentment. We stood there awkwardly, the tension thick between us. I broke the silence. We have a problem, and like it or not, we need to work together to solve it. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but I pressed on, explaining everything that had happened. The threats, the break-in, the connection Tom had uncovered. You think someone's out to get you because of us? Jack scoffed. Sounds like karma to me. I couldn't argue with him. It was karma, but it was also more than that. It was a calculated attack. And it was aimed at all of us. Look, I said, my tone firm. I know you have no reason to trust me. But this isn't just about me anymore. Whoever's behind this won't stop with me. They're after you too, and they won't stop until they've destroyed all of us. Karen looked at me, her eyes narrowing. What do you expect us to do? Help you? After everything you've done? I don't expect anything from you, I replied, keeping my voice steady. But if we don't work together, we're all going to suffer for it. We need to find out who's behind this and stop them before it's too late. There was a long pause as they both considered my words. Finally, Karen spoke. What do you need from us? Information, I said. We need to figure out who this person is, and the only way to do that is by pooling what we know. We need to trace every connection, every person who might have a grudge against us. Jack crossed his arms, clearly still skeptical, but he didn't walk away. And what happens after we find them? Then, I said, my voice hardening, we deal with them. It was clear that neither Karen nor Jack trusted me, and I didn't blame them. But they also knew that they had no choice. We were all in too deep, and if we wanted to survive this, we needed to set aside our hatred and work together. Over the next few days, we met several times, exchanging information and trying to piece together the puzzle of who was targeting us. Tom continued his investigation, following up on leads and gathering intelligence. The tension between us was palpable, but we managed to keep it in check, focusing on the task at hand. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The person behind this wasn't just motivated by revenge. They were systematically dismantling our lives, one piece at a time. And they were doing it with the precision of someone who knew us all too well. It became clear that this wasn't just about me or my revenge against Karen and Jack. This was something bigger, something darker, and we were all just pawns in someone else's game. After weeks of digging and piecing together clues, we finally got a break. Tom managed to trace the anonymous messages to a burner phone, which led us to a name, Sam Weller. It wasn't a name any of us recognized, but further investigation revealed a connection to Jack's past. Years ago, before Jack moved into our neighborhood, he had been involved in a business venture that had gone sour. Sam Weller had been his partner, a man Jack had double-crossed to secure a better deal for himself. It was a betrayal that had cost Sam everything, his business, his reputation, his livelihood. And now, it seemed, Sam was back for revenge. We arranged to meet Tom at a safe house he had set up, a secluded cabin away from the city. The air was thick with tension as Karen, Jack, and I arrived, knowing that we were about to confront the person who had turned our lives upside down. Tom had tracked Sam down to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. He was living under an assumed name, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. But Tom was good at what he did, and he had managed to pinpoint Sam's location. The plan was simple: confront Sam, get him to confess, and end this once and for all. But as we stood outside the motel, nerves began to set in. This wasn't just about finding answers, this was about survival. Tom led the way, his presence a steadying influence as we approached the door to Sam's room. He knocked, and after a tense moment, the door creaked open. Sam was nothing like I had expected. He was gaunt, his face lined with the wear of years of bitterness and anger. But there was a fire in his eyes, a look of satisfaction as he saw us standing there. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who's come to visit. The homewrecker and the mastermind himself. Enough games, Sam, Tom said, stepping forward. We know what you've been doing, and it's over. Over? Sam laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. You think this is over? It's just beginning. You ruined my life. And now I'm going to ruin yours. He stepped back, letting us into the room. It was cluttered with papers, photos, and evidence of his meticulous planning. He had been tracking us for months, documenting every move we made, every weakness he could exploit. You destroyed me, Sam spat, his voice trembling with rage. All of you. And now you're going to pay. We had nothing to do with what happened to you, Karen said, her voice shaking. This is between you and Jack. Sam's eyes flicked to her. And for a moment, I saw the depth of his obsession. Oh, but you're all part of this now. You're all guilty. I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. Sam was unhinged, driven by a need for revenge that had consumed him entirely. There was no reasoning with him, no way to talk him down. Let's end this, Sam, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You've had your revenge. We're finished here. Finished? Sam's eyes blazed. No, we're just getting started. Before we could react, Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun. The room froze, and I felt my heart stop. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to confront him, to stop him, but now everything had gone horribly wrong. Tom stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, but Sam was beyond reason. Back off, he shouted, waving the gun at us. You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can just ruin my life and leave me to rot? Sam, listen, Tom started, but Sam cut him off. No. You listen. I'm not done with you. I'm not done with any of you. The tension in the room was unbearable, every second dragging out into an eternity. I could see the fear in Karen's eyes, and the resignation in Jack's. We were trapped, and there was no way out. In a flash, Tom lunged at Sam, trying to wrestle the gun from his hand. The room erupted into chaos as the two men struggled, the rest of us frozen in shock. There was a deafening bang, and then silence. I looked down and saw Tom slumped on the floor. Blood spreading across his shirt. Sam stood over him, the gun still in his hand, his eyes wide with shock at what he had done. The reality of the situation hit us all at once. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was life and death, and the stakes had just become terrifyingly real. As Sam stared at Tom's lifeless body, I knew we had to act quickly. This had to end now before anyone else got hurt. And it was up to us to make sure it did. The room was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and the raw tension of what had just unfolded. Sam stood there, the gun trembling in his hand, as we all tried to process what had just happened. Tom was dead, and we were alone with a man who had nothing left to lose. Karen was the first to break the silence, her voice shaky but desperate. Sam, this isn't you. You don't have to do this. But Sam's eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of rage and panic. You don't understand, he shouted, his voice cracking. You took everything from me. Everything. And now you're going to pay. I knew we had to stay calm and find a way to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled even further out of control. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could turn this around. Sam, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, we can still fix this. You don't have to go down this path. Killing us won't bring back what you lost. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You think I care about that anymore? I've lost everything because of you people. There's nothing left for me now. Jack, who had been silent up until now, took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Sam, I'm the one who wronged you. Let the others go. Do you want revenge? Take it out on me. Sam's gaze shifted to Jack, his expression hardening. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't dreamed of this moment, of making you suffer the way I have? Jack nodded, his voice calm, almost resigned. Then do it. But leave them out of this. They didn't betray you, I did. The room was thick with tension as Sam seemed to consider this. But then, he shook his head, a twisted smile forming on his lips. No, you're not getting off that easy. This isn't just about you, Jack. It's about all of you. You all played a part in this. It was clear that reasoning with him was futile. Sam was too far gone, too consumed by his thirst for revenge. But we couldn't just stand there and wait for him to act. I had to do something, and I had to do it now. As Sam's attention flickered between us, I slowly inched closer, trying to position myself near the window. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay focused. If I could just get close enough. Karen must have sensed what I was trying to do because she suddenly stepped forward, drawing Sam's attention. Sam, think about what you're doing, she pleaded. If you kill us, there's no going back. You'll lose everything. It was the distraction I needed. With Sam momentarily focused on Karen, I lunged forward, grabbing a heavy lamp from the table and swinging it with all my strength. The impact was brutal, and Sam staggered back, the gun slipping from his grasp. Karen screamed, and Jack rushed forward, tackling Sam to the ground as I kicked the gun away, sending it skidding across the floor. The room was chaos, the struggle between Jack and Sam violent and desperate. I grabbed the gun, my hands shaking, but before I could do anything, Sam broke free, shoving Jack aside and making a run for the door. We all watched as he bolted, leaving us breathless and shaken. It was over, at least for now. But the damage had been done, and the consequences of this night would haunt us all. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the gunshot that had echoed through the quiet night. They found us in the room, still reeling from the events that had just transpired. Tom's body lay motionless on the floor, a grim reminder of how close we had come to disaster. We were all taken to the station, our statements carefully recorded. The officers were professional, but there was a palpable tension in the air as they pieced together the story of what had happened. It wasn't just a simple case of self-defense. It was a convoluted mess of betrayal, revenge, and tragedy. Sam was arrested a few hours later and found hiding in a nearby alley, disoriented and bleeding from the head wound I had inflicted. The man who had once been our neighbor, our friend, was now a shadow of his former self, consumed by the darkness that had driven him to such extremes. As the days passed, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Tom was gone, and no amount of explanation could change the fact that he had died because of the chain of events I had set in motion. I had wanted revenge, and in my pursuit of it, I had created a monster that had ultimately cost an innocent man his life. Karen and Jack, too, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The investigation cleared us of any wrongdoing, but the scars were there, raw and painful. The bond between Karen and Jack, once based on secrecy and betrayal, was now strained to its breaking point. They couldn't look at each other without seeing the consequences of their actions. As for me, I was left to grapple with the guilt of what I had done. I had sought revenge and had destroyed 3 lives in the process, including my own. The satisfaction I had once felt was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that I couldn't escape. I decided to leave the city, to put as much distance between myself and the memories as possible. I packed up my belongings and moved to a small town where no one knew my name, where I could start over, free from the shadows of my past. But even as I tried to build a new life, the weight of what had happened stayed with me. I couldn't escape the truth. I had set this all in motion. I had been so consumed by my need for vengeance that I had lost sight of everything else, and now I was paying the price. In the quiet of my new home, I often found myself thinking back to that night, to the choices I had made, and to the people I had hurt. I wondered if there was a way to make amends, to somehow find redemption for what I had done. But I knew that some things couldn't be undone. That some wounds would never heal. I had wanted to destroy Karen and Jack, and in the end, I had destroyed us all. As I sat alone in my small, empty apartment, I realized that the true cost of revenge was far greater than I had ever imagined. Months passed after I left the city, but the memories clung to me like shadows I couldn't escape. The new town, with its quiet streets and unfamiliar faces, offered a sense of anonymity I desperately needed, but it couldn't erase the guilt that gnawed at me day and night. I threw myself into work, taking up odd jobs and keeping to myself. I avoided deep conversations and personal connections, afraid that if anyone got too close, they'd see the cracks in my facade. The man who had once lived for revenge was now just a shell, hollowed out by the consequences of his own actions. One day, as I was walking through the town's small market, I heard someone call my name. It startled me. No one here knew who I really was. I turned to see an old friend from the city. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Mike? Is that you?" She asked, her face a mix of surprise and concern. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been a while." We exchanged small talk, the kind that skirts around the truth, but eventually, she brought up the past. "I heard what happened. About Tom, about everything," she said, her voice soft. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Everyone back in the city is still talking about it. Karen and Jack, well, they're not together anymore. It all fell apart after, you know. The news didn't surprise me. Their relationship had been built on lies and deceit, and it was only a matter of time before it crumbled under the weight of what had happened. But hearing it confirmed brought a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of responsibility. "What about Sam?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "He's in prison. They say he's not doing well, mentally. The trial was a mess. His lawyers tried to argue temporary insanity. But..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Sam's life was over, and in a way, so were Karen's and Jack's. I had gotten my revenge, but at what cost? I had set out to destroy them, and in the process, I had destroyed myself too. We said our goodbyes, and I walked away, her words echoing in my mind. The past wasn't something I could run from, it was a part of me now, as much as I wished it wasn't. The silence I had sought in this new town was heavy, filled with the echoes of what I had done. That night, as I sat in my small apartment, I thought about the life I had before everything fell apart. I thought about the man I used to be and the man I had become. And I realized that I couldn't keep running from the past. I needed to face it, to find a way to make peace with it. The next day, I called the one person I had been avoiding, my sister. She had tried to reach out to me after everything happened, but I had pushed her away, not wanting to drag her into the mess I had made. But now, I needed to talk to someone, to tell the truth to someone who would listen. When she answered, I could hear the worry in her voice. "Mike? Is everything okay?" "No," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't think it ever will be. But I need to talk. I need to tell you everything." And so I did. I told her about the affair, the revenge, and the devastating fallout. I didn't hold back, didn't try to sugarcoat the truth. I laid it all out, every ugly detail, and when I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my voice hollow. "I just needed you to know." We talked for a long time after that, not about the past, but about the future. She encouraged me to seek help and to talk to someone who could guide me through the darkness I was in. And for the first time, I considered it. I didn't want to keep living like this, burdened by the weight of my own mistakes. It wasn't going to be easy. The road to redemption, if there even was one, would be long and painful. But I knew I couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from what I had done. I needed to find a way to move forward, to live with the choices I had made. In the end, revenge had cost me everything. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find some kind of peace, to rebuild something from the ashes of my old life. And so, I took the first step. I made an appointment with a therapist, someone who could help me untangle the mess I had made of my life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to keep me going. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done with revenge. It had taken everything from me, and now, it was time to find a way back to myself.